Sarah Mitchell adjusted her worn baseball cap and wiped the sweat from her forehead as she climbed into the cockpit of the massive Apache helicopter. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield in Afghanistan, and the familiar smell of jet fuel mixed with desert dust filled her nostrils. She had been flying these machines for over 8 years now, but today felt different somehow. The routine maintenance check should have been simple. Sarah ran her hands along the control panels, checking every switch and gauge with the precision that had kept her alive through countless missions. Her fingers moved automatically across the weapon systems, testing the 30mm chain gun that hung beneath the aircraft like a deadly promise. The Apache was a beast of war, designed to strike fast and disappear into the sky, but right now it sat silent and still. Sarah had always been good with machines. Growing up on her father's farm in Kansas, she could fix tractors before she could properly drive them. Her small hands and quick mind made her perfect for the intricate work required to keep military aircraft flying. When she enlisted at 19, nobody expected the quiet farm girl to become one of the most skilled Apache technicians in the entire Army. The other soldiers on the base knew her as the woman who could make any helicopter fly again, no matter how badly damaged it was. She worked long hours in the scorching heat, often covered in grease and hydraulic fluid, earning the respect of pilots and ground crew alike. Her supervisor, Sergeant Rodriguez, often said she had magic in her fingers when it came to fixing things that others had given up on. But Sarah carried secrets that went far beyond her mechanical skills. The small patch sewn discreetly on the inside of her uniform jacket told a story that most people would never believe. It was a story of night missions that officially never happened, of targets eliminated with surgical precision, and of a young woman who had become something much more dangerous than anyone realized. As she continued her inspection, Sarah noticed a loose connection in the targeting system, the kind of problem that could mean the difference between life and death in combat. She pulled out her tools and began the delicate work of rewiring the connection, her movements smooth and confident. This was her world, surrounded by the deadly machinery of war, but feeling more at home here than anywhere else. The base was quiet this early in the morning. Most of the other soldiers were still sleeping or grabbing breakfast in the mess hall. Sarah preferred these peaceful moments before the chaos of the day began. Soon enough, pilots would be rushing to their aircraft, engines would be roaring to life, and the sky would be filled with the thunder of rotors heading out on missions that might bring some of them home, and others not at all. She thought about the letter from her mother that had arrived yesterday, full of news about the harvest and questions about when she might come home for a visit. Her family still saw her as their little Sarah, the girl who used to help her father fix farm equipment and who had surprised everyone by joining the military. They had no idea what she had really become during her years of service. The sun climbed higher, and Sarah could hear the first sounds of the base waking up. Voices carried across the airfield, and she could smell coffee brewing in the nearby command building. Soon her peaceful morning would be over, and she would return to being just another technician, blending into the background while the real warriors prepared for their missions. But appearances could be deceiving, and Sarah Mitchell was living proof that the most dangerous people often looked the most ordinary. As she finished her work on the Apache and prepared to climb down, she had no idea that in just a few hours, a chance encounter with a visiting pilot would change everything and force her to confront the secrets she had worked so hard to keep hidden. Captain Jake Harrison stepped off the transport helicopter and immediately felt the blast of Afghan heat hit his face like a wall. He had been flying Apache helicopters for 6 years, but this was his first deployment to this particular forward operating base. His orders were simple: report to the flight line, get briefed on local operations, and prepare to take command of a new squadron. Jake had earned his reputation as one of the best Apache pilots in the Army through a combination of natural skill and relentless training. He could thread his aircraft through mountain valleys at high speed, engage multiple targets with deadly accuracy, and bring his crew home safely, even when everything went wrong. His fellow pilots respected him, and his commanders trusted him with the most difficult missions. As he walked across the dusty airfield, Jake noticed a lone figure working on one of the Apaches. The person was small and moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of experience. From a distance, he assumed it was one of the younger enlisted men, probably doing routine maintenance. Jake had always made it a point to know his ground crew personally, understanding that their work was what kept him alive in the air. The base was larger than he had expected, with rows of helicopters, supply buildings, and temporary structures that housed hundreds of soldiers. Jake could see why this location was strategically important. Nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, it provided an excellent launching point for operations throughout the region. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, the kind of place where small mistakes could have fatal consequences. Jake's new commanding officer, Colonel Williams, had warned him that this base operated differently than others. The missions here were often classified at the highest levels, and some of the personnel had backgrounds that were not to be discussed openly. The colonel had been deliberately vague about the details, but Jake understood that he was walking into a situation where asking too many questions would not be appreciated. As he approached the helicopter where the maintenance worker was busy, Jake decided to introduce himself. Building good relationships with the ground crew was essential for any pilot who wanted to survive long in this environment. He had learned early in his career that the mechanics and technicians often knew more about what was really happening on a base than the officers did. The figure working on the Apache was completely absorbed in their task, carefully adjusting something in the targeting system with the kind of precision that impressed Jake. Most mechanics worked quickly and efficiently, but this person moved with an almost surgical attention to detail. Jake could see that whoever this was, they really knew their business. He was still 50 yards away when he noticed something that made him pause. The way the mechanic moved, the posture, the careful attention to detail, all seemed familiar somehow. Jake had encountered thousands of military personnel over the years, but something about this person triggered a memory that he could not quite place. The morning sun was getting stronger, and Jake could feel sweat beginning to form under his flight suit. He continued walking toward the Apache, planning to introduce himself and get a sense of how things worked at this base. The mechanic still had not noticed his approach, focused entirely on the delicate work being performed on the aircraft's weapons system. Jake thought about the briefing he had received before deployment. There had been references to special operations personnel being stationed at this base, people whose presence was known only to those with the highest security clearances. The briefing officer had mentioned that some of these individuals might be operating under cover identities, appearing to have routine military jobs while actually serving in much more dangerous capacities. As he got closer, Jake could see that the mechanic was wearing standard military fatigues, but something about the way they carried themselves suggested training that went far beyond basic maintenance work. The movements were too controlled, too aware of surroundings, like someone who had been taught to always be ready for danger. Jake was now close enough to speak, and he cleared his throat to announce his presence. The mechanic's reaction would tell him a lot about who he was dealing with. In his experience, ordinary maintenance workers would look up casually, but someone with special training might react very differently to an unexpected approach. He was about to find out just how different this base really was from the others he had served on, and how the quiet mechanic working on the Apache helicopter was about to turn his understanding of military operations completely upside down. Sarah heard the footsteps approaching across the concrete, but she did not look up immediately. Years of training had taught her to finish whatever task she was working on before acknowledging interruptions. The targeting system calibration required absolute precision, and any distraction could result in equipment that failed when lives depended on it. The footsteps stopped about 10 feet away, and Sarah could sense someone waiting patiently for her attention. This was different from the usual ground crew, who would typically call out a greeting or make some noise to announce themselves. Whoever was standing behind her had military discipline and understood the importance of not disturbing critical work. Sarah made the final adjustment to the targeting computer and carefully closed the access panel. Only then did she turn around, wiping her hands on a shop rag and expecting to see another technician or perhaps a supervisor checking on her progress. Instead, she found herself looking at an officer she had never seen before. Captain Jake Harrison stood with his hands clasped behind his back, wearing a clean flight suit that marked him as recently arrived. His posture and bearing immediately told Sarah that this was someone accustomed to command, probably a pilot based on his wings and the confident way he carried himself. She could also tell from his expression that he was studying her with more interest than a casual introduction would warrant. Sarah snapped to attention and saluted properly, falling back on military protocol when faced with an unfamiliar situation. The captain returned her salute and smiled, but there was something in his eyes that made her uncomfortable. It was the look of someone trying to remember where they had seen her before, and that was a look Sarah had hoped never to encounter. "Captain Harrison," Jake said, extending his hand. "I'm the new squadron commander. Just wanted to introduce myself to the ground crew and get a sense of how operations work here." "Specialist Mitchell, sir," Sarah replied, shaking his hand briefly. "I handle maintenance on Alpha and Bravo flights." Jake continued to study her face, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind. She kept her expression neutral and professional, but inside she was running through possibilities. There were not many places where a pilot might have encountered her, and none of them were situations she wanted to discuss with anyone at this base. "How long have you been stationed here, Specialist?" Jake asked, still with that searching look in his eyes. 14 months, sir," Sarah answered. "Before that, I was at Fort Campbell for advanced training." The mention of Fort Campbell seemed to trigger something in Jake's memory, and Sarah saw recognition beginning to dawn in his expression. Fort Campbell was where many special operations personnel received training, and it was also where Sarah had spent 6 months learning skills that had nothing to do with helicopter maintenance. Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to place her in a specific memory. Sarah knew that if he kept thinking about it, he would eventually remember where he had seen her before. When that happened, her carefully constructed cover would be blown, and she would have to face consequences that could end her career or worse. "Have we met before?" Jake asked directly. "You look familiar, but I can't quite place where I might have seen you." Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her training kept her outward appearance calm. "I don't think so, sir. I would remember meeting a pilot of your rank." But even as she said it, Sarah could see that Jake was not convinced. His memory was working overtime, sorting through years of military service and trying to connect her face with a specific time and place. She realized that she needed to end this conversation quickly before he remembered too much. "If you'll excuse me, sir," Sarah said, "I need to complete my inspection of the other aircraft before the morning briefing." Jake nodded, but his eyes never left her face. "Of course. Carry on, Specialist." Sarah gathered her tools and moved toward the next helicopter in line, but she could feel Jake's gaze following her. She knew that he was not going to let this go, and that sooner or later he would remember exactly where he had seen her before. When that happened, everything she had worked to keep hidden would come to light. As she began working on the next aircraft, Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could request an immediate transfer, but that would raise questions and might make the situation worse. She could try to avoid contact with Captain Harrison, but on a base this size that would be nearly impossible. Or she could wait and hope that his memory failed him. But Sarah had not survived this long by hoping for the best. She needed to prepare for the moment when Jake Harrison remembered who she really was and what she had done during those classified missions that officially never happened. Jake could not shake the feeling that he knew Specialist Mitchell from somewhere important. Throughout the morning briefing and his first meetings with squadron personnel, her face kept appearing in his thoughts. The way she had moved, the controlled manner of her speech, the slight hesitation when he had asked about Fort Campbell, all pointed to someone with training far beyond basic aircraft maintenance. After lunch, Jake decided to review personnel files in his temporary office. As the new squadron commander, he had access to basic information about all ground crew personnel, but he suspected that Specialist Mitchell's real background might not be fully documented in standard military records. People with certain types of training often had official files that told only part of their story. Sarah Mitchell's file was surprisingly thin for someone who had been in the military for several years. It listed her basic training, her advanced technical school, and her current assignment, but there were gaps in the timeline that suggested periods of service that were not being documented. Most telling was the lack of any specific information about her time at Fort Campbell beyond a simple notation that she had completed advanced training. Jake had spent enough time around special operations personnel to recognize the pattern. When someone's military record had obvious gaps or used vague terminology like advanced training, it usually meant they had been involved in classified activities. The question was what kind of activities and why someone with that background was now working as a helicopter mechanic at a forward operating base. As Jake continued reading, he found a note in Mitchell's file that caught his attention. It mentioned that she had been awarded several commendations during her service, but the details of these awards were classified at a level above his clearance. For a maintenance specialist to receive classified commendations was unusual, to say the least. The more Jake learned, the more convinced he became that Sarah Mitchell was not who she appeared to be. But without higher-level clearance, he could not access the information that would tell him her real story. He was starting to understand why Colonel Williams had warned him that this base operated differently than others. That evening, Jake found himself walking past the maintenance area, where Sarah was working late on one of the helicopters. The hangar was mostly empty except for a few night shift personnel, and the lighting cast long shadows across the aircraft. Sarah was alone, completely focused on her work, and Jake decided this might be his opportunity to have a more direct conversation. "Working late, Specialist?" Jake said as he approached. Sarah looked up from the engine compartment she had been inspecting. "Yes, sir. This bird has been having some power fluctuations, and I want to make sure it's flight ready for tomorrow's mission." Jake noticed that even though they were alone and in an informal setting, Sarah maintained perfect military bearing. There was no relaxation in her posture, no casual conversation. She remained alert and professional, like someone who had been trained never to let her guard down. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning," Jake said carefully, "about whether we might have met before." Sarah's hands never stopped moving as she continued her work, but Jake saw a slight tension in her shoulders. "Like I said, sir, I would remember meeting you. The thing is," Jake continued, "I keep thinking about a mission I flew about 2 years ago. It was a night operation, very classified, involving extraction of personnel from a hostile area. There was someone on that mission who looked a lot like you." For the first time since he had met her, Sarah stopped working and looked directly at him. Jake could see intelligence and calculation in her eyes, the look of someone deciding how much truth to reveal. It was the expression of a person accustomed to keeping secrets. "I think you might be mistaken, sir," Sarah said quietly. "I've never been involved in any flight operations." But Jake could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what mission he was talking about. More importantly, he was beginning to remember details from that night that made everything clear. The classified extraction, the person who had materialized out of the darkness to guide them to the target, the individual who had seemed to know the terrain and enemy positions with impossible accuracy. "The person I'm thinking of," Jake said slowly, "was wearing a patch I'd never seen before. Something that looked like it belonged to a unit that doesn't officially exist." Sarah's reaction was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight widening of the eyes, a momentary pause in breathing, the unconscious movement of her hand toward the spot on her uniform where such a patch might be hidden. Jake knew he had hit the target. "I think we need to talk," Jake said quietly. "Really talk." Sarah looked around the empty hangar, confirming they were alone, then set down her tools. When she spoke again, her voice had changed from that of a respectful enlisted soldier to something much more direct and dangerous. "That conversation never happened, Captain. And if you're smart, you'll forget whatever you think you remember about any night missions." Jake realized he was no longer talking to Specialist Sarah Mitchell, helicopter mechanic. He was facing someone whose real identity and capabilities were far more complex and dangerous than anything he had imagined. The tension in the hangar was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake realized he had pushed too far and was now in completely uncharted territory. The woman standing before him was no longer playing the role of a simple maintenance worker, and the dangerous edge in her voice told him that he had stumbled into something much bigger than he had imagined. Sarah studied Jake's face for a long moment. Clearly debating how to handle this situation, she had spent months carefully building her cover identity, and now a chance encounter with a pilot from her past was threatening to unravel everything. The worst part was that Jake seemed like a decent person, which made what she might have to do next much more difficult. "You have no idea what you're messing with," Sarah said quietly. "Some secrets are kept secret for very good reasons." Jake held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Look, I'm not trying to cause problems for anyone. I just recognized you from that mission and I was curious. If you're here under deep cover, I can respect that." "Curious," Sarah repeated with a bitter laugh. "Curiosity has gotten a lot of good people killed in this business." She moved to the hangar door and checked to make sure they were still alone, then returned to where Jake was standing. Her movements were fluid and purposeful, like someone accustomed to operating in dangerous situations. Jake was beginning to understand that he was dealing with a highly trained operative whose public identity was completely fabricated. That mission, you remember, Sarah said, officially never happened. The people involved were never there and the target was never eliminated. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Jake nodded slowly. He was familiar with how classified operations worked, but he had never been personally involved with someone whose entire identity was a carefully constructed lie. The implications were staggering, and he was beginning to realize why Colonel Williams had been so vague about some of the personnel at this base. How many others are there? Jake asked. How many people here are not who they appear to be? Sarah smiled grimly. That's exactly the kind of question you should never ask, and I should never answer. But Jake could see in her expression that he was not the only one at this base who had stumbled onto something unexpected. Sarah was clearly evaluating him, trying to decide whether he could be trusted or whether he represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. The thought sent a chill down Jake's spine. I need you to understand something, Sarah continued. The work I really do, the reason I'm actually here, it's not something that can be exposed. Too many lives depend on maintaining operational security. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what she was telling him. So what happens now? Do I pretend this conversation never happened? Do I get transferred to somewhere far away? Or do I just disappear? That depends on you, Sarah said. Can you forget what you think you know and go back to being just another pilot who doesn't ask questions about the ground crew? Jake considered his options carefully. He could report what he had discovered to Colonel Williams, but that might result in consequences for Sarah that he did not want to be responsible for. He could try to forget the whole thing, but he knew that would be nearly impossible. Or he could try to understand more about what was really happening at this base. What if I said I wanted to help? Jake asked. What if instead of being a problem, I could be an asset? Sarah's expression became even more guarded. Help with what? You don't even know what we're really doing here. Then tell me, Jake said. I've got the clearances, I've got the skills, and apparently I've already stumbled into this whether I wanted to or not. Sarah was quiet for a long time, clearly weighing risks and possibilities. Jake could see that she was making calculations that went far beyond anything he could understand. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. There's someone you need to meet, she said. Someone who can decide whether you're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small communication device that looked nothing like standard military equipment. After a brief, coded conversation with someone on the other end, she put the device away and looked back at Jake. Tomorrow night, after the base goes quiet, meet me at the east perimeter fence. Come alone, don't tell anyone where you're going. And if you change your mind about any of this, tonight is your last chance to walk away. Jake nodded, understanding that he was about to cross a line that he could never uncross. I'll be there. Sarah gathered her tools and prepared to leave the hangar. Before she walked away, she turned back to Jake one last time. Captain Harrison, that patch you mentioned, the one from the unit that doesn't exist, you were right about one thing. It does tell a story, but it's not a story that has a happy ending for people who can't keep secrets. With that warning hanging in the air, Sarah disappeared into the darkness, leaving Jake alone with the realization that his new assignment was about to become far more complicated and dangerous than anything he had ever imagined. Jake spent the entire next day trying to act normal, while his mind raced with questions about what he had gotten himself into. Every interaction with other personnel made him wonder who else might be operating under false identities. Every routine briefing left him listening for hidden meanings. The base that had seemed straightforward when he arrived now felt like a place where nothing was quite what it appeared to be. During the morning flight operations, Jake found himself watching Sarah from a distance as she performed her maintenance duties. To anyone else, she looked like just another competent technician doing her job. But now that he knew what to look for, Jake could see subtle signs that set her apart from the other ground crew. The way she moved with constant awareness of her surroundings, how she positioned herself to always have clear sight lines and escape routes, the unconscious way she checked for potential threats. Colonel Williams stopped by Jake's office in the afternoon to check on how he was settling in. The conversation was routine until the colonel mentioned that some of the personnel at the base had unique backgrounds, and that Jake should feel free to discuss any concerns with him directly. Jake wondered if this was a test, a way of finding out whether he had discovered anything he should not have. Everything seems to be running smoothly, Jake said carefully. The ground crew appears very professional. Good, Colonel Williams replied. Some of our people have served in challenging assignments before coming here. It's important that they feel their service is appreciated and their privacy respected. Jake understood the message. Whatever he had stumbled onto, his commanding officer was aware of it and expected him to handle the situation appropriately. The question was whether tomorrow night's meeting would be seen as handling it appropriately or as a serious breach of protocol. As evening approached, Jake found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on routine duties. He kept thinking about Sarah's warning that the story behind her patch did not have a happy ending for people who could not keep secrets. He was walking into a situation where the wrong decision could have consequences far beyond a simple career setback. The base grew quiet after dark, with only essential personnel remaining on duty. Jake waited until well past midnight before making his way toward the east perimeter fence. He moved carefully, avoiding areas with security cameras and staying in shadows whenever possible. The skills he had learned during his own special operations training came back naturally, even though it had been years since he had needed to use them. Sarah was already waiting when he reached the designated meeting point. She had changed out of her military uniform and was wearing dark civilian clothing that made her blend into the darkness. Next to her stood a man Jake did not recognize, someone whose presence immediately commanded attention despite his unremarkable appearance. Captain Harrison, the man said quietly. I'm Commander Mitchell. No relation to Specialist Mitchell here despite the shared name. Jake shook the offered hand and immediately recognized the grip of someone accustomed to violence. Commander Mitchell had the bearing of a career military officer, but there was something about him that suggested his career had taken place largely in the shadows, away from official recognition. Sarah tells me you've been asking questions about things that happened during missions that never officially took place, Commander Mitchell continued. That puts us in an interesting position. I'm not looking to cause trouble for anyone, Jake said. I just recognized her from an operation I was involved in, and one thing led to another. The operation you're thinking of was successful because of Sarah's work, the commander said. She spent 3 weeks behind enemy lines gathering intelligence and setting up the extraction point. Without her, your helicopter would have flown into a trap that would have killed everyone on board. Jake looked at Sarah with new understanding. He had wondered how the extraction team had known exactly where to find their target, and how they had avoided the enemy forces that should have been guarding the area. Now he realized that someone had been there before them, preparing the way and eliminating threats. The patch you noticed, Commander Mitchell continued, belongs to a unit that handles situations too sensitive for regular military operations. We go places and do things that allow other people to sleep safely at night, and in return we ask only that our existence remain secret. Why are you telling me this? Jake asked. Why not just transfer me somewhere else or make sure I forget what I saw? Because we have a problem, the commander said, and we think you might be able to help us solve it. Sarah stepped forward and handed Jake a folder containing photographs and documents. There's been a security breach. Someone has been passing information about our operations to hostile forces. 3 of our people have been killed in the past month because someone leaked details about their missions. Jake looked through the photographs, seeing images of military personnel he did not recognize but whose deaths had clearly been the result of betrayal rather than combat. What does this have to do with me? We think the leak is coming from someone with access to flight operations, Commander Mitchell said. Someone who knows helicopter schedules, mission routes, and personnel assignments. We need someone on the inside who can help us identify the source. You want me to spy on my own people? Jake asked. We want you to help us save lives, Sarah said. The person doing this has already gotten good people killed, and they're going to keep doing it until we stop them. Jake realized that his chance encounter with Sarah had led him to the center of a deadly game of espionage and betrayal. The simple life of a squadron commander was over, and he was being asked to become part of something much more dangerous. What exactly would you need me to do? He asked. Commander Mitchell smiled grimly. That depends on what we find out about who's been selling secrets. But I can promise you this, Captain Harrison. Before this is over, you're going to learn that being ordinary is sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be. 3 weeks later, Jake found himself in the middle of the most complex and dangerous operation of his military career. Working with Sarah and Commander Mitchell's team, he had identified the source of the security leaks. Major Robert Chen, a logistics officer who had been selling mission details to insurgent forces in exchange for money to cover gambling debts. The discovery had come through careful observation and analysis of communication patterns. Jake had noticed that certain missions seemed to encounter unexpectedly heavy resistance, while others that should have been dangerous went smoothly. By correlating these patterns with personnel who had advanced knowledge of flight operations, they had narrowed down the list of suspects to a handful of people with the right access and opportunity. Major Chen had been careful to cover his tracks, using encrypted communications and offshore accounts to hide his activities. But he had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated the determination and skills of the people hunting him. Sarah's technical expertise had allowed her to trace digital communications that Chen thought were secure, while Jake's position as squadron commander gave him access to operational details that revealed the pattern of betrayal. The final proof had come when they fed Chen false information about a fictional mission and watched as enemy forces moved to intercept aircraft that were never actually deployed. It was the confirmation they needed, but it also meant that Chen had to be stopped before he could do any more damage. The confrontation took place in Chen's quarters late one evening. Jake had arranged for the major to be called away from a scheduled meeting, while Sarah and two other members of the covert team positioned themselves to prevent escape. When Chen returned to his room, he found them waiting for him with evidence of his betrayal spread across his desk. "Major Chen," Commander Mitchell said calmly, "we need to talk about your recent financial transactions." Chen's face went white as he saw the bank records, communication logs, and mission reports that documented his activities. For a moment it looked like he might try to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. Instead, he collapsed into a chair and put his head in his hands. "How many people died because of what you did?" Sarah asked quietly. Chen looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I just needed the money. The debts were going to destroy my career, my family, everything." "So you decided to destroy other people's families instead," Jake said, struggling to keep his anger under control. The interrogation continued for several hours, with Chen providing details about his contacts, his methods, and the scope of information he had sold. It became clear that the damage was even worse than they had initially suspected. Dozens of operations had been compromised, and the enemy had used Chen's information to plan attacks that had killed or wounded numerous Allied personnel. By dawn, Chen had confessed to everything and agreed to cooperate with efforts to roll up the network he had been feeding information to. He would face court-martial and probably spend the rest of his life in military prison, but his cooperation might prevent further deaths and help capture the insurgent leaders who had purchased his betrayal. As the sun rose over the base, Jake found himself standing with Sarah near the same Apache helicopter where they had first met. The morning felt similar to that day weeks ago, but everything had changed. Jake was no longer just a squadron commander, and Sarah was no longer hiding behind the identity of a simple maintenance worker. "So what happens now?" Jake asked. "Do you disappear to another assignment, another identity?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time since he had known her, the expression seemed completely genuine. "Actually, I think I'm going to stay here for a while. It turns out that having a squadron commander who knows what's really going on might be useful for future operations." "And Major Chen? He'll get what he deserves," Sarah said simply. "But more importantly, the people he betrayed will get justice." Jake looked out across the airfield, watching as other pilots and ground crew began their daily routines. Most of them would never know how close they had come to disaster, or how a chance encounter between a curious pilot and a mechanic who was not what she seemed had saved their lives. "That patch you wear," Jake said. "The one from the unit that doesn't exist. What does it really mean?" Sarah reached into her jacket and pulled out the small piece of fabric that had started everything. It was black with a simple design that could have meant anything to someone who did not know its significance, but to those who earned the right to wear it, it represented something much more important than official recognition or public praise. "It means that some people are willing to do whatever it takes to protect others," Sarah said. "Even if it means looking ordinary, even if it means never getting credit for what you do, even if it means carrying secrets that you can never share." She pinned the patch back inside her jacket, out of sight but not forgotten. Then she picked up her tools and walked toward the helicopter that needed her attention, looking like just another maintenance worker starting another ordinary day. But Jake knew better now. He understood that the most extraordinary people often looked the most ordinary, and that the real heroes were usually the ones whose stories would never be told. As he watched Sarah begin her work, he realized that he had learned something more valuable than any military training could teach. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people the world never sees, and sometimes the greatest courage is displayed by those who look like they could not hurt a fly. The Apache's gun remained silent that morning, but Jake knew that when the time came, both the machine and the woman who maintained it would be ready for whatever dangers lay ahead.